All right, so let's get going on today's class. So what we're going to do today is all right. So what we're going to do today is we are going to finish up our look at Harry. And if you remember, last time we saw the video, they had just completed their baseline. So that's where we're going to start with our current with the video today. So they had just finished their baseline. They had just observed Harry to see how much he self-abused across a variety of different situations. So this lets them know just how extreme his self-abuse was. This gives them a way to compare the self-abuse during their treatment with the self-abuse that occurred prior to treatment to let them know if Harry is improving. So this is where we're going to pick up, and we're going to see the rest of the treatment. And then after the video, we're going to take a more in-depth look into the techniques and things that they used to treat Harry, and basically see a lot of the things that we've been learning about in psychology of learning in this semester being used to treat this self-injurious individual. So once again, picking up after the baseline, and we'll see how they treated Harry.
His left arm by wrapping it in his shirt. This was the first time he self-restrained. Unfortunately, we would see a lot more of this self-restraint.
All right, so just real quick, I wanted to point out the extinction procedure that they've implemented right now. So what they've done is they are no longer reinforcing Harry for Harry's self-abuse. So when he was first asked in the first session, we're going to take your restraints and you're going to count to 100. And then during the timeout period, he was self-abusing. What they did was they did not reinforce that by no longer asking him to count to 100. So notice right when they came back after the 5-minute timeout period, Harry still had to do that task of counting to 100. So they did not remove the task as a result of the self-abuse, thereby negatively reinforcing the self-abuse. What they did is they implemented an extinction procedure and said, all right, you self-abused, and the consequence of that will be nothing. So there's no consequence now for self-abusing, or in terms of removing a task, there's no removal of a task anymore. You're no longer getting reinforced for self-abusing. You're still going to have to count to 100. All right, so very quickly, just to show you the differential reinforcement of other behavior, notice that Harry can still achieve reinforcement. He still gets his restraints back, so that's positive reinforcement. He will get praise as they go through, but notice that they're reinforcing another behavior. So in this case, you're asking him to count to 100. So you can still earn reinforcement, but not for self-abusing. Now you earn it for counting to 100. So that's an example of differential reinforcement of other behavior, because you can still pound on yourself while you're counting to 100. So keep an eye out later on when they switch that to differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior and start having Harry do things with his hands that do not allow himself to self-abuse at the same time. All right, so this is the first example of differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, because they're going to ask him to catch a ball, they're going to play with the ball, and in order to do that, you need to have your hands engaged. So he predominantly hits himself with his fists. If you're holding on to a ball, if you're throwing a ball, you can't really do that. It's an incompatible behavior. So this is an example of that differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, a more effective version of the differential reinforcement of other behavior. All right, so that was the treatment of Harry. So what we're going to do now is do a little bit more of an in-depth analysis. I made some comments during the video about some of the things that we've been learning in this class. But before we get to that in-depth analysis, any questions, comments? Excuse me. About the treatment of Harry? Mm-hmm.
It was recently how they stopped learning when they were training trying to change that behavior, that they had the same consistency to work with it, because they kind of made me wonder if in other cases it would be easier with naturalism to let people once, because even though he was training behaviors. So like when he got eliminated from it, it didn't see so much of the impact that if he left, would his behavior change back to their vitality was active. Like I was wondering if they use the same stat full time, if they kind of alternate that.
Well, that's a very good question, and Dr. Fox does mention that at the end. One of the big questions about treatment programs like this is what happens once you hand it off to somebody else? What happens once you hand it off to the family and the staff that is working at that center? And in Harry's case, it was successful. And what basically occurs is that the staff is trained on whatever the treatment is that you did with Harry, and that treatment is implemented from there on. So regardless of who was working with Harry, whether it was Dr. Fox, whether it was Harry's parents would also have to receive training, or whether it was one of the staffs at the center, they were basically still continuing with the extinction paradigm. So even when Harry was wearing the glasses as his appropriate form of self-restraint, if he self-abused, once a task was asked of him, those glasses would get taken away for 5 minutes, right? I mean, he was on that same treatment program for his entire life. Now, gratifyingly, he just eventually stopped self-abusing, and you wouldn't have to go through that extinction paradigm. But basically, they took the treatment that they demonstrated was effective and then handed it off to anybody that was working with Harry. And in this case, it was successful. Any other questions about? Yep.
If he started self-abusing and he took off like the restraint or whatever it was at the time, did they add more time if he continued to self-abuse, or did they just like keep it consistent, like, oh, well, you already did the action in 5 minutes, or did they?
Yeah. So in this, in the way that the treatment was designed, self-abuse would lead to 5 minutes of timeout. And anything that happened during that timeout phase did not count towards any other sort of contingencies. So he was free to self-abuse during those 5 minutes. But once they returned, you notice this in a few treatment times, once they returned, that restarted the session. And if he self-abused again, then the restraints were removed for another 5 minutes. So that treatment, as much as possible, again, would have been implemented for the rest of Harry's life. And that's why they mention that, Harry was very adaptable and they had to remain very contingent with him. Basically what they meant was we kept these contingencies in place, the extinction procedure, the differential reinforcement of other behavior procedure, those were still in place for Harry. Any other questions or comments? All right, so let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail, kind of highlight some of the things that we've been learning about this semester and how it was used in Harry's treatment. And through this, just try to, it always kind of gets to me, try to appreciate just how powerful the techniques that we're learning in this class actually are. So remember what Harry was like at the beginning of this video. He was a 25-year-old individual who was self-abusing for the majority of his life, so self-abusing since he was a child, so over 2 decades of self-abuse. And he got to the point where his life was sitting in a room watching TV all alone while restrained. That was literally what he had to wake up in the morning and look forward to. He got to be alone, sit there, watch TV in restraints. That was his life. Literally, he was in, a prison of sorts where he wasn't able to do anything else. They had 2 treatment days with Dr. Fox, and they got him up to over 2 hours outside of his restraints with no self-abuse. After that, I don't know what the exact timeline is, but you can just see from Harry, it's not that long. We're not talking years. We're talking months of treatment to get to the point where he is now no longer self-abusing, no longer wearing restraints other than eyeglasses or a wristwatch, being trained in the vocational center, being able to have some sort of self-control, get treats, get trade-in tokens for various rewards for TV times. Basically, he's been given a life. So he went from restrained in his own prison where he did nothing, had no kind of self-fulfilling behavior, and using the techniques that we've learned in this class, in a matter of months, undid over 20 years of training and basically regained his life. So remember that next time you're excuse me, next time you're reading a chapter in psychology and you're wondering why you're doing this, why you're putting yourself through all this challenge in your educational pursuits, is because this is the kind of information and knowledge you need if you want to affect people's lives that substantially. All right, so let's take a look at some of the techniques that were used in Harry. We'll kind of go through chronological order of things that we covered early on in the semester, all the way up to our recent topics. So let's start off first with the single subject designs. So in Harry, they used a single subject design because this treatment was designed specifically for Harry. And his type of situation is rare enough that you cannot wait around for 10, 12 people who have been self-abusing since they were, young children, who are 6'6" males who use their size to intimidate other people, who have been reinforced with their restraints for self-abuse. You can't wait until you find 12 of those. If they did, this was back in 1980, I believe, that they treated Harry. If they waited for 12 of those, he might have gotten treatment 5 years ago, right? He would have had to wait like 30 years. So they needed to treat him that day, starting with that treatment. They needed a single subject design. And what they did was they did this reversal design where they started off with a baseline condition. So much like in our previous examples, they started off first with a baseline condition. So if you remember, on that first day of treatment, they started off with Harry out of restraints, and they were just recording how often does he self-abuse. So they had viewers in the other room recording how often Harry self-abused when he had to do a reading task, how often he self-abused on a wide variety of tasks, how often he self-abused when he was left alone, how often did he self-abuse when he was eating. Basically, if there was no consequences for the self-abuse, i.e., there's no treatment for the self-abuse, what's his level of self-abuse? So those baseline sessions gave them their baseline measure. They now knew how problematic the behavior was. It was a high, continuous rate of self-abuse. So he would self-abuse steadily throughout the entire baseline session. Then they started their treatment. So the treatment was that they would ask a task of Harry. If Harry self-abused, he would still be required to complete that task. That's the extinction paradigm. And also they had differential reinforcement of other behavior, so he could earn back his restraints by counting to 100. He would get praise for catching the ball. So they had that as their treatment session, extinction and differential reinforcement of other behavior. And throughout the treatment session, they found that Harry could spend increasingly long times out of restraints without self-abuse. So what happened was, during those treatment sessions, Harry's level of self-abuse dropped below the baseline. However, that drop below baseline is not enough to let Dr. Fox and his colleagues know that it was the treatment that caused the change in Harry's behavior. So they mentioned that other extraneous factors could have caused this change in behavior. And one of those was alluded to. Maybe it was just the presence of Dr. Fox. Maybe Harry is just intimidated by people with beards. Maybe Harry was very impressed that this person who he kept ripping shirts off of, kept coming back with a new shirt. Maybe he thought Dr. Fox was a magician that had magical wizarding powers, one of which is the creation of shirts. Ludicrous, for sure, but possible, right? There are all these other possible reasons why Harry's self-abuse might have gone down during the treatment phase. And the last thing Dr. Fox wanted to do was to hand over this treatment to the staff and family that were going to take care of Harry if the treatment was not what was causing the change in behavior. So Dr. Fox had to make sure that it was the treatment that was causing the behavior, not some other ludicrous or unseen variable. So what they did was, on the second treatment day, they removed the treatment. They basically allowed Harry, once again, to self-abuse out of restraints with no consequences. So without having that 5-minute timeout period, they removed the treatment. And what they found was that Harry, during that baseline, return to baseline, went right back to his high, stable level of self-abuse. And that told him that he wasn't decreasing his self-abuse because he was intimidated by a beer. That lets him know that he wasn't decreasing his level of self-abuse because he thought Dr. Fox was some weird shirt wizard, right? That tells him that it wasn't some other variable, it was actually the treatment that caused this decrease in self-abuse. So once they knew that, they returned back to the treatment phase. So they went with a baseline treatment, return to baseline, and then finally a return to treatment phase to make sure that Harry's decrease in self-abuse was due to the treatment. And as I said before, once they returned to treatment, this is where Harry stayed for the rest of his life. He has been under treatment, basically under these contingencies, for the remainder of his life. All right, so that was a real-life example of the reversal design. Another thing that they did here, and it was subtle, and it wasn't very well documented, but I think it's worth pointing out. Another single subject design that they used was the multiple baseline across behaviors design. So if you remember in single subjects design, sometimes you don't want to use a reversal design in order to treat an individual. In Harry's case, they were able to use a reversal design for his self-abuse because his self-abuse was not so dangerous that it would have been unethical to use a reversal design and to allow himself to self-abuse again. But they did actually have multiple behaviors that they wanted to treat in Harry as well. So the multiple baselines means that you begin the treatment of, in this case, let's go to the behavior one. You begin the treatment of one behavior after a certain baseline period. Then you begin the treatment of another behavior after a different baseline period. And if the behaviors only decrease or only change after their baseline expires and their specific treatment is implemented, then you have evidence that it's your treatment that is being effective. So the first behavior that they were treating was the self-abuse. So we had the baseline where they measured the self-abuse, then we had the treatment where they were treating the self-abuse. What was another behavior? They didn't show a baseline for it, but what was another behavior of Harry's that they wanted to get rid of, they wanted to decrease, and they trained that, or they treated that at a later time? Mm-hmm.
Self-restraining?
The self-restraining, they tried to treat that from the beginning because they would not allow him to self-restrain. So that was part of the getting rid of the restraints procedure. Mm-hmm.
They wanted him to learn to be more polite, like say thank you and please and
Exactly. So the politeness, the listening to the instructions of the experimenter. There was another.
staring at him.
The kind of close-up intimidation that he used to do as well. So all of those are true. So they treated initially they treated the self-restraint. They treated the self-abuse and did not allow Harry to self-restrain. But then also as they went on, they treated other things. They treated other behaviors, not right at the beginning, but later on. So the non-compliance, they treated the non-compliance they treated straight off at the beginning, making sure that Harry was behaving in appropriate manners, making sure that Harry was behaving in appropriate ways. I got my things out of order here. So put a pin in that, put a pin in the behaviors. We'll start off with multiple baselines across situations. They didn't show the baselines here, but we had Harry first being treated in the observation room. That is situation number 1. Then he was treated outside at McDonald's and at the 7-Eleven. That's situation number 2. Then he was treated in their educational rooms. That was situation number 3. And if the behavior decreased in those situations only after the treatment was begun in those situations, that would be an example of multiple baseline across situations. Multiple baselines across behaviors we saw. They treated the self-abuse. That was the first baseline that expired. So they measured it in the baseline procedures and then they treated it. They didn't show the measurement of the politeness and close talking, but they did start treating that later. So if you rewatch the video, notice that in the beginning, Dr. Fox is not doing anything about Harry getting up into his face. At the beginning, when Harry gets up into Dr. Fox's face, there's no consequence. Dr. Fox is not treating that particular behavior at that point. However, later on, Dr. Fox does start introducing consequences for that behavior. So in this instance here, he was explaining to Harry the game, and he's like, we're going to take the ball. And as soon as Harry went into his face, he takes the ball away. And then when Harry steps back, he's like, we're going to take the ball. And as Harry stands in his face, he's like, take the ball away. Stop talking to him. And then also here, he was giving Harry the silent treatment. So if you notice, every single time Harry came up to his face, Dr. Fox would stop talking. So that is a treatment. Try to think of which contingency. We'll circle back to that. But again, Dr. Fox is like, we'll work a page, and then we'll go outside. And remember, he was quitting talking. He was stopping talking every single time Harry got close to him. And then also there was that couple of times when he actually did it to Harry as well. So not only did he stop the actual conversation, but there was a few times where he actually got into Harry's face. And I love that line where he goes, this is what crazy people do. It's like, you're not crazy, so stop it. And, that was the treatment of that impoliteness, that close talking. But again, notice that it wasn't done at the beginning. So they treated the self-abuse first, treated that impolite, close talking after the expiration of a second baseline. All right. Contingencies, 4 types of contingencies. So we have the removal, let's start off with that. The removal of the restraints if Harry's self-abused. So when Harry's self-abused, the restraints were taken away. They were taken out of the room for 5 minutes. And as we saw, Harry's self-abuse decreased as a result of that contingency. So which of the 4 types of contingencies was that particular contingency? Which one was the taking away of the restraints out of the room if Harry's self-abused? Negative punishment. Very nice. So that was negative punishment because the behavior was self-abuse. If Harry self-abused, something was taken away. His restraints were. That led to the behavior decrease. So that was negative punishment. So the 5 minutes of timeout from restraints, that was an example of negative punishment. That was one of the contingencies that Dr. Fox was using in his treatment program. As you hopefully picked up, there were a ton of contingencies that were being used in this program at the same time. So unlike the sort of clean textbook examples where you're like, well, there's one contingency we're setting up for Sniffy, here's another contingency we've set up. In a real life scenario, to make your treatment as effective as possible, you would want to use multiple concurrent, that is at the same time, contingencies. So one is that we have negative punishment. Another contingency that we have, or that was used, was positive punishment. So this one wasn't used very much. One of the third level of their treatment protocol, the brief contingent electric shocks, would have been an example of positive punishment. But does anybody remember an example of positive punishment where Harry did a behavior, something was presented, and then that behavior decreased?
Possibly when he was trying to intimidate Dr. Fox, and Dr. Fox got in his face a little bit.
Exactly. So that time when when Harry went up into Dr. Fox's face, and Dr. Fox was like, if you're going to do this to me, I'm going to do this to you. Basically what he said was that this behavior that you're doing is now going to be presented with something. It's going to be presented with my face up in your face. That led to a decrease in the behavior. Harry did not do close talking as much. That is an example of positive punishment. So he also had some positive punishment contingencies, such as getting in Harry's face when Harry got into his face when he was doing his close talking. So we had both types of punishment. We have positive reinforcement was used extensively here as well. So we have a particular behavior, now a behavior that you're not looking to decrease, a behavior that you're looking to increase. We have a certain behavior that is results in the presentation of something. That leads to an increase in the behavior. That's positive reinforcement. So what are some of the examples of positive reinforcement?
The Coke and the pretzels.
Coke and the pretzels. So you do this task, you'll get some Coke, you'll get some pretzels. That led to an increase in the probability of the task being done. Positive reinforcement.
When they went to McDonald's and 7-Eleven.
When they went to McDonald's and 7-Eleven. He didn't self-abuse. That led to the presentation of McDonald's and 7-Eleven. That led to increase in his appropriate behavior. Mm-hmm. Giving him the restraints back. So you count to 100. We're going to present you with something. We're going to present you with your restraints. That led to an increase in his probability of counting to 100 in the future. That was positive reinforcement. So there was positive reinforcement used throughout Harry's treatment. So we mentioned a few of those. Another one, notice how often they praised Harry. Notice how often they were like, good job, Harry. Good job on the ball. Nice catch, Harry. Nice throw. All of those things are positive reinforcement. Because Harry throws the ball, they say, good job. That's presenting something. You're presenting literally words into Harry's environment. That led to a higher probability of Harry catching the ball in the future. That's an example of positive reinforcement. So all of those, the Coke and the pretzels, the returning of the restraints, all of those are examples of positive reinforcement. All right, and they also had negative reinforcement, not in Harry's treatment, but in Harry's history. So we mentioned this a little bit last time. So where in Harry's history was negative reinforcement used? So not in the treatment, but sometime in his past. His parents. So his parents, unfortunately and unknowingly, were making Harry's self-abuse worse because they were negatively reinforcing, and so was the staff, actually, at the institution that Harry was at, because he was being negatively reinforced for his self-abuse. So Dr. Fox mentions this. They never actually show it, but Dr. Fox mentioned this. When he was in his institution, they go, Harry would be asked to do a task. He would mumble something. If he was pressed on that task, he would self-abuse, and then he would be left alone. So notice what happens is that there's a task that Harry needs to do, right? Some sort of educational task, for example. Harry self-abuses. That's the behavior. He then gets left alone. i.e. that task that he had to do is taken away. So he had to do the task, behavior occurs, task gets taken away. That leads to an increase in the probability of his self-abuse. That is negative reinforcement. So both the parents and the staff at that institution were unfortunately negatively reinforcing the very behavior that they were trying to get rid of in Harry, that self-abuse. All right, shaping. We saw shaping in this treatment of Harry as well. So shaping is when you gradually create operant behaviors through successive approximations of that behavior. So the example we saw before is of the little girl trying to learn the piano. You basically take the variability in the behavior that she has, reinforce the good behaviors, punish the bad behaviors, and then gradually bring her along through successive approximations, closer and closer to the point where she's actually playing the piano at a professional level. So we saw a similar thing with Harry. So what was it? What was the major form of shaping that occurred in terms of Harry? What was something that they started out small and then gradually increased and increased and increased?
How often he had restraints?
The time that he was out of restraints. So the major instance of shaping that occurred was the time that Harry was required to stay out of restraints. So their goal, you can think of it in this way, you have a 24-hour period. And their goal for that 24-hour period was to get Harry up to the point where he would not self-abuse for 24 hours in a 24-hour period, right? That's kind of end goal of this therapy. When they first met Harry, though, he was a novice at not self-abusing, right? He was basically at the beginning stages here. So they couldn't expect him to not self-abuse for 24 hours. They couldn't just wait around for that. And when he, one chance in a billion that he's not going to self-abuse in 24 hours, and then reinforce that, right? They couldn't do that. That's not practical. So what they said is, all right, we're going to reinforce Harry for successive approximations to that 24 hours. And we'll start off with a small time that we require him not to self-abuse, and then we're going to increase that time and gradually shape that not self-abusing behavior to the point where it gets larger and larger and larger. So we saw in treatment session 1, that was a failure. Harry wouldn't take off his restraints, so they took the restraints out. Treatment session 2, Harry was able to stay 2 minutes out of his restraints with no self-abuse. So 2 minutes was part of Harry's natural variation, right? So if Harry's over here, this line is 2 minutes. That line might be 5 minutes. That line might be 4 minutes. Well, no, that line is 1.5 minutes. That line is 1 minute. That line is 30 seconds. That line is 0 seconds. He has a variable amount of behavior that he can do. The first one that they reinforce is at 2 minutes. And once they do that, 2 minutes out of self-abuse becomes more probable. And then what you do is you start increasing from that direction, all the time going towards that full 24 hours without self-abuse. So in treatment session number 2, they required him to stay out of restraints for 2 minutes with no self-abuse. Treatment session number 4, they increased that to almost 3.5 minutes out of restraints with no self-abuse. Treatment session number 5, they get it up to almost 6 minutes out of restraints with no self-abuse. Treatment session number 7 was a session where Harry self-abused, so he was put in timeout. Treatment session number 10, they now have it up to 6 minutes and 40 seconds of no self-abuse. So you can see that as the treatment sessions go on, even when Harry fails in his treatment sessions, and there was a few of those where he went in a row and he was self-abusing, and I mean, it's pretty dramatic how hard he self-abuses. I mean, you can hear his fist slapping into his head. So again, just kind of the importance of what we do here. But by the time they got to treatment session 18, that was 17 minutes and 10 seconds. So that was the end of treatment session number 1. And they got him up to 17 minutes and 10 seconds. That was done through shaping. If they had this requirement from the first treatment session, if the first time they wanted Harry out of restraints, they required him to not self-abuse for 17 minutes, Harry would have failed on session 1, he would have failed on session 2, he would have failed on session 3, session 4, session 5. They would have went the whole day, and Harry never would have been reinforced for staying out of restraints. But through shaping, they brought him to 17 minutes in a single day just by gradually reinforcing staying out of restraints without self-abuse for longer and longer times. And then they didn't give as much detail about what happened in treatment session or treatment day number 2. However, by the end of that day, they had continued with their shaping and they had gotten Harry to 2 hours and 17 minutes out of restraints with no self-abuse. So once again, by gradually increasing the amount of behavior or the amount of non-self-abuse, the time required, they were able to bring Harry along and shape that behavior to the point where they got basically 24 hours per day with no restraints and no self-abuse. All right. Intermittent schedules. We mentioned this one last time, so we'll give a brief recap of this. One of the reasons, again, why psychologists study these intermittent schedules and the effects of these intermittent schedules is because each of them gives a sort of characteristic pattern of behavior. And in the real world, in a real world situation, you will not know which of these schedules is being implemented, for example, for your client, right? You might not be able to follow them around for 24 hours a day and spy on them and see what the contingencies are in their environment, right? You might not have access to this the way that we do for Sniffy, right? So in the Sniffy assignments, it's not a question of what schedule he's on because we put him on that schedule. When we have control of somebody's environment, we can say, oh yeah, you're on a fixed interval 50-second schedule because that's what I put you on. So these have been studied because in the real world, you don't know which one of these a patient might be on, but you do, or you are able to observe their behavior. And what they found with Harry was that Harry, when he was self-abusing, he had a high stable rate of self-abuse. That means that his self-abuse followed that pattern of behavior, where the rate of behavior was high, the self-abuse was high, there was no post-reinforcement pause. As Dr. Fox mentioned, he had that high stable rate of self-abuse. And a high stable rate of self-abuse is the characteristic pattern that occurs for a variable ratio schedule. So a variable ratio schedule is what leads to this pattern of self-abuse. So when Dr. Fox observed that pattern of self-abuse, number one, he knew that Harry's self-abuse was being reinforced. All right, that's the first takeaway. As soon as you see that high stable rate, you know that there's a reinforcement contingency that is occurring. The second thing he knew was that because it was high, because it was stable, no post-reinforcement pause, Harry had been reinforced on a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. And as we mentioned before, this is just a natural outcome of the fact that Harry's parents tried their best. They tried to help Harry. They tried to treat his self-abuse like any parents would. And they were more successful on some days and less successful on others. They had higher willpower on some days, they had lower willpower on others. On the days where they had high willpower, Harry would have had to self-abuse a lot in order to be negatively reinforced by the task being taken away. On their low willpower days, Harry would not have to self-abuse very much to be negatively reinforced by his task being taken away. And because we've all felt it, there's days when we're in the zone, there's days when we can barely handle, the challenges that we face. That led to this variable ratio of reinforcement for Harry, and that made his problem actually much worse than if they had given in to Harry every single time. All right, the last thing we'll do this next time. So next time when we continue our analysis of Harry, we're going to pick it up at theories of reinforcement, specifically the response deprivation hypothesis. And again, this is one of the ingenious things of this treatment. And we're going to see, again, we'll just delve into deeper why it was that Dr. Fox knew going in that the restraints that Harry had